Hello, and welcome to another episode of Philosophy TV. I'm speaking with Abril Fairweather in San Francisco. Abril teaches at the San Francisco State University in the philosophy department, and he is the author of several solo articles on virtue epistemology and other topics in epistemology, as well as a manic collaborator. He's worked with people such as Linda Zagzebski, and he's currently coming out with a collected volume with Cambridge University Press entitled Naturalizing Virtue Epistemology.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's a very nice introduction. Manic collaborator, I'm afraid, is true. Mark Alfano is a distinguished guest fellow at the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study. Mark is the author of a forthcoming book on virtue ethics and virtue epistemology. Mark also has some very interesting articles and work in moral psychology. And today we'll be discussing situationism and virtue epistemology. I'll be introducing virtue epistemology now. If you had anything you wanted to add before we get into that, Mark?
No, I think that it'd be great if you could sort of lay out the ideas that are sort of grounding this debate, and then I'll sort of come at you with some empirical stuff.
Okay, I'm sure you will. Okay, so I'll give here just a general overview of the origins of virtue epistemology, the main commitments that have been driving it, and some of the main species of virtue epistemology that have emerged in contemporary literature. So since the appearance of Ernest Sosa's groundbreaking 1980 essay, The Raft and the Pyramid, Lorraine Code's 1987 book, Epistemic Responsibility, and Linda Zagzebski's book, Virtues of the Mind, virtue epistemology has become one of the most influential and productive movements in contemporary theory of knowledge. This approach is motivated by the recognition that knowledge is a normative discipline. To know is to have done something right, well, or good, at least from an epistemic point of view. But the normative aspect of knowledge is often muted in theories of knowledge, especially in the wake of naturalistic approaches to epistemology inspired by Quine. So in this spirit, virtue epistemologists draw upon work in virtue ethics to develop accounts of intellectual rather than moral virtue, and then analyze knowledge or other important epistemic standings as manifestations of intellectual or epistemic virtues. Epistemic virtues will share a general normative structure with moral virtues, but will typically be distinguished from moral virtues by having true belief as their aim. Some virtue epistemologists see a closer connection between virtue ethics and virtue epistemology than others, but all draw upon the general normative structure of a virtue in theorizing about knowledge and other important epistemic properties. So let me here mention a couple instances of virtue theoretic definitions of knowledge. You can hear what they sound like. So here's a couple definitions of knowledge that we can pull from virtue epistemology. Knowledge is true belief held out of intellectual virtue. That's from Sosa. Knowledge is a true belief that manifests intellectual virtues of the agent, also Sosa. Adding a little more complexity to some of these definitions, we have S is subjectively justified in believing P, insofar as S is epistemically virtuous in believing P, i.e. is responsible, open-minded, impartial, conscientious, courageous, humble, etc. That's a definition from James Malmarquet. We have from John Greco, S knows that P only if S is believing that P results from the dispositions that S manifests when S is motivated to believe the truth, and as a result is objectively reliable in believing P. That's John Greco. Finally, Linda Zagzebski has the following definition. An act of intellectual virtue A is an act that arises from the motivational component of A, is something a person with virtue A would probably do in the circumstances, is successful in achieving the end of the A motivation and is such that the agent acquires the true belief through these features of the act. So those are some examples, I think, of increasing complexity of ways in which this approach to knowledge go about defining it. So we can see in most or all virtue theoretic accounts of knowledge versions of a success from ability norm, where different versions of virtue epistemology will differ on the kinds of successes and abilities relevant to knowledge. It's important to note that a virtue theoretic account requires not only a success condition and an ability condition, but will also include an etiological requirement that the success be sufficiently due to the ability. How to best understand this etiological condition is a hot and I think somewhat troubled topic in virtue epistemology. It brings in issues of epistemic luck, explanation, agency, and motivation into the analysis of knowledge. So, two fundamental commitments of any virtue epistemology will be: one, reversing the traditional direction of analysis between persons and beliefs, and two, the ontology of person-level dispositions, faculties, skills, character traits. Traditional epistemology is belief-based in that good-making features of beliefs confer good-making properties on believers. On the traditional approach, epistemic terms of appraisal, or rational, justified, warranted, apply to persons just in case their beliefs, or the propositional contents of their beliefs, satisfy certain formal requirements that are defined independently of the virtues. These formal properties might include probabilifying relations for Bayesians or evidentialists, inferability from basic beliefs, perceptual or self-evident beliefs for foundationalists, explanatory coherence with other beliefs for coherentists. So virtue epistemology reverses this direction of analysis and confers good-making features on beliefs when they're appropriately related to good-making properties in the agent, that is, to their intellectual virtues. So features of the agent, rather than their beliefs, are what are generating epistemic value and epistemic standing for their beliefs. And these epistemic standings will transmute some true beliefs to knowledge. However, simply satisfying the direction of analysis thesis isn't sufficient for being a virtue epistemology, because there is a specific type of person fact that generates epistemic value, namely a person's virtues. A virtue epistemology will thus commit us to a specific ontology, or epistemic psychology, which defines what sorts of things in the agent generate epistemic value. These will specifically be their virtues. So presumably the situationists have a lot to say about that particular feature of virtue epistemology. So let's say a couple more. Oh, go ahead.
Oh,
sure.
go ahead.
Well,
I'm sorry, I didn't realize there was more. Go ahead.
No problem. I've just got a couple more points, and then I'll hand it over. So we can say just a couple of the different forms of virtue epistemology that have taken shape around these general commitments. The internal debates within virtue epistemology arise from accepting different accounts of the nature of virtue. So the history of virtue theory provides at least three different accounts of the nature of virtue, and important issues are in play depending on which general account of the virtues we take, primarily how internalist or externalist our virtue epistemology will be. The three main accounts are that virtues are faculties, you can get that from Aquinas, virtues are skills, we can get that from Plato and the Stoics, and finally, the most familiar view is that virtues are character traits, which we get from Aristotle. So epistemologists have developed these defining commitments in different ways, and we now have a plethora of different forms of virtue epistemology. And I suspect the number is growing by the moment. The main divisions within virtue epistemology from its inception to the present are reliabilist virtue epistemology, responsibilist virtue epistemology, and mixed reliabilist responsibilist accounts. So some virtue epistemologies are proposed as moves in the traditional project of providing an analysis of knowledge, while others aim to illuminate a broader notion of a flourishing intellectual life and the features of virtuous inquiry. So there's some other things that we can say, but I think this is a good time to actually hand that over to you and get your comments.
Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit at first about the motivation for the kind of argument that I'll be offering here. And that comes from not virtue epistemology, but virtue ethics. Now, like epistemology, virtue ethics has sort of been on the rise in recent times. It's been on the rise for a bit longer. Perhaps one of the more prominent examples is Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue, which was published several decades ago by Notre Dame Press. And that kind of, in many ways, sparked the virtue revolution. The idea in virtue ethics is that one doesn't want to focus only on acts as bearers of moral qualities or only on consequences as bearers of moral qualities, or even on intentions. But instead, one wants to think about the kind of agent that is a morally good agent, a virtuous or agent, or an agent with good character. Now, that has been a very useful way to go, and it's emphasized to us that we need to think not only about the sort of short term, well, what's the right thing to do in these circumstances, but in a sort of more continuous way, what sort of person do you want to be? What sort of character traits would make you a good person? However, thinking about ethics in this way commits one to certain empirical claims, or so it's been argued. And in particular, it's been argued by people like John Doris, whose book I'm holding up right now, that the sorts of traits that virtue ethicists identify as normatively relevant are not the sorts of traits that most people can have. So Doris argues on the basis of evidence in social psychology, especially drawing on The Person in the Situation by Ross and Nisbet, that instead of thinking that people might be, let's say, generous or courageous or modest or temperate across the board, most people don't have that kind of cross-situational consistency, and you'll find people who are, let's say, courageous in the face of rifle fire, but not courageous in the face of wild animals, or people who are honest towards their friends and dishonest towards their family, or people who are generous with young women and not generous with anyone else, or generous when they're in a good mood, but not generous when they're in a neutral or bad mood. And this
Uh-huh.
suggests that people are not sort of set up to have the kinds of traits that, at least pre-theoretically, we tend to think that they have in terms of ethical virtues. And that's been a problem that's been responded to for quite some time now, about a couple decades. One of the more prominent and helpful responses, I think, is Robert Adams' A Theory of Virtue. And I'm working on a response of my own right now, in fact. But so the way that this relates to virtue epistemology is that you might think that in the same way that social psychology suggests that people don't have the kinds of traits that are relevant to virtue ethics, you might think that social psychology and cognitive psychology might show us that we don't have the kinds of traits that are relevant to virtue epistemology either. And this is the kind of worry that I'm going to be raising today. So let me just transition into the argument, the sort of broad strokes argument that I think applies to the reliabilist brand of virtue epistemology. You might recall that Abril, when he was introducing virtue epistemology, said that reliabilism is the brand of virtue epistemology that's most closely associated with Ernie Sosa and John Greco. And the basic idea here is that the virtues are not motivational as such. They're not things like curiosity and open-mindedness. They're more like dispositions to transfer from one evidential state to another. So things like good eyesight, sound inference, good deduction, a capacious memory, and so on. And I think that there's a problem generated not by social psychology, but by cognitive science and cognitive psychology for this kind of trait. because someone who has, let's say, the disposition to make good inferences is going to make them across the board, regardless of seemingly trivial and epistemically irrelevant situational influences. So here's the way I think about it. There's a kind of inconsistent triad when you're thinking about virtue epistemology, especially reliabilist virtue epistemology. On the one hand, you don't want to fall for skepticism. So you want some kind of commitment to non-skepticism that says most people know a lot of things, especially the things that we think that they know. And then you also want to say that knowledge is true belief acquired uh, in accordance with or from the intellectual virtues identified by reliabilism. Things like sound inference, sound deduction, good eyesight, and capacious memory. But then you've got the problem of epistemic situationism, which says that actually most people acquire a really large percentage of their beliefs not in accordance with those kinds of dispositions, but rather in accordance with the heuristics and biases that have been identified and studied by the likes of Kahneman and Tversky. So I can go into the some specific examples of these heuristics, but before I do, maybe April, you might want to clarify or uh, make a quick objection. Is there anything that occurs to you at this point?
Well, yeah, I think in general, this seems like a very interesting worry. And it seems like it's had some success or had some traction in virtue ethics. And it seems really, I think, important and relevant to be applying this to virtue epistemology, especially given that close relationship that has typically existed between virtue epistemology and virtue ethics. This just seems like a very interesting and appropriate kind of challenge. Um, my hope is that it
Great.
ultimately will be fruitful and beneficial to the field of virtue epistemology rather than bringing it down. But I think that's going to be one of the interesting things that will be part of the debate.
All right. Well, let's see if I can slash and burn a little bit, and then you can tell me where I'm wrong.
Okay.
Um, so let me identify a few of the heuristics that have been studied by Kahneman and Tversky. I'm holding up a couple of their books now, just so you can get a look at what they look like. And so let me start with this. If you were to estimate the number of seven-letter words that end in ing in 2,000 words of an ordinary novel, stretch of prose, um, if you're like most people, you would say that it's around 14. And now, if I asked you instead to identify the number of words you would expect to see that were seven letters long and whose second to last letter was N in the same stretch of prose, you would probably, if you're like most people, say about four. Now, as it turns out, that's strictly speaking impossible because every seven-letter word that ends in ing is also a seven-letter word whose second to last letter, of course, is N.
Right.
And yet, most people, when they think about that kind of question, will make estimates that are not just wrong, but actually inconsistent. As a matter of fact, if you ask different people this type of question, roughly 90% of them will give you answers that, if you match them up with one of their counterparts, are inconsistent. Now, you might not think that that's so bad because, after all, letters with ing or words with ing at the end are, not the sort of thing that we think about all the time. But it gets to be worse the more directly you test this sort of thing. So, in one version of the study that I mentioned just now, different people were asked about estimating the number of words that they would see with these characteristics. Kahneman and Tversky thought, well, what if you just asked the same person, how many words would you expect to see that end in ing, and how many would you expect to see whose second to last letter is N? Well, still, in that case, 85% say that they expect to see more words ending in ing than whose second to last letter is N. And you might start to wonder at this point, like, what's going on? Well,
Yeah.
what they think is that people use the accessibility of words as an index of their frequency or probability. And in general, people use accessibility as an index of frequency or probability. And so, since it's easier to think of a word that ends in ing because you just take any verb and you turn it into a participle, than it is to think of a word whose second to last letter is n because you don't have this sort of mechanism where you say, okay, start with a verb, turn it into a participle. Then it seems like there are more such words to you, and then you're sort of off to the races saying that you expect there to be more of these words in a stretch of prose, even when you're sort of comparing the two types side by side. Now, that's kind of bad, but still, it's not the sort of activity that ordinary people go through all the time, right? We don't sort of sit down and ask ourselves, how many words are we going to see that end in ing in a given stretch of prose? We read about the characters and we want to know what Hamlet's going to do. So Kahneman and Tversky thought, well, what if we gave people sort of a little prompt? We sort of shine the light of reason in their eyes and get them to see that this is not the right way to go about this. And so what they did was they gave people two arguments. They gave them an argument that said it's more likely that the seven-letter words that end in ing, sorry, it's you should expect to see more words ending in ing than whose second to last letter is n in a given stretch of prose because it's easier to think of such words versus a different argument that said, well, since every word that ends in ing is a word whose second to last letter is n, it must be the case that there will be more words whose second to last letter is n than words that end in ing. And still, 65% of people answered inconsistently by picking the first argument rather than the second argument as more convincing. So this suggests that the accessibility heuristic not only is prevalent, but that it's really robust. And of course, you might think, well, that's not so bad. It's better to use accessibility as an index of probability or frequency than a lot of other things, right? It's better to use accessibility than the weather. It's better to use accessibility than anti-accessibility. The harder it is to think of something, the
Right.
more common it is. So you might think, well, that's not so bad, but still, I think it is pretty bad because even if you're using a heuristic when you have nothing else to go on, you want to be consistent at the very least. Let me give you just one other example
Sure.
of a heuristic that's been studied by Kahneman and Tversky and others. This is the representativeness heuristic. So with the representative heuristic, you don't use accessibility as an index of frequency or probability. Instead, you use the representativeness of an example as an index of how common or how frequent or how probable that example is. So in one very sort of famous study, Kahneman and Tversky had people read a little description of a woman that they called Linda. And I'll just read that description to you now, if I can
Great.
find it.
That's great. I'll have something to say about Linda as well. That's great.
Okay. Good. So here's what they said about Linda. Where'd it go? Here we go. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. So Kahneman and Tversky gave people this description, and then they asked people to rank, in order of probability, 8 different statements. I'll reel them off to you quickly. So one was Linda is a teacher in an elementary school. Linda works in a bookstore and takes yoga classes. Linda is active in the feminist movement. Linda is a psychiatric worker. Linda is a member of the League of Women Voters. Linda is a bank teller. Linda is an insurance salesperson. And finally, Linda is a bank teller who's active in the feminist movement. And the two crucial propositions there are Linda is a bank teller on the one hand, and Linda is a bank teller who's active in the feminist movement on the other hand. It's of course impossible that it's more likely that Linda is a feminist bank teller than that she's a bank teller, because of course all feminist bank tellers are bank tellers, but not all bank tellers are feminist bank tellers. And what Kahneman and Tversky wanted to do was to test whether the fact that Linda is sort of more representative of being a feminist than any other property that's mentioned here, that people would say that it's actually more likely that she's a feminist bank teller than a bank teller. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly what they found. So when you have people rank these things in order, about 90% of them say it's more likely that Linda is a feminist bank teller than a bank teller. And now, again, you might think that that's kind of bad, but after all, there's 8 propositions that are being compared here, and it's easy to get lost in that kind of mess. So they said, okay, well, what if we just give people the 2 relevant propositions? We give them, on the one hand, just Linda's a bank teller, and then we give them, on the other hand, the conjunction, Linda is a bank teller who's active in the feminist movement. Surely then they would see that this is a mistake to say that it's more likely that she's a feminist bank teller. Well, no. In that case, 85% of people committed the conjunction fallacy. So they said, okay, still, it's not the sort of thing that people do ordinarily. People are better at sort of assessing arguments and sort of seeing what arguments are more convincing. So let's instead give people a pair of arguments and ask them which is more convincing. And so we'll give them argument 1, which says that Linda's more likely to be a bank teller than she is to be a feminist bank teller, because every feminist bank teller is a bank teller, but some women bank tellers are not feminists, and Linda could be one of them. Or, on the other hand, argument 2, Linda's more likely to be a feminist bank teller than she is to be a bank teller, because she resembles an active feminist more than she resembles a bank teller. Still, in this case, 65% of people picked argument 2. Right, so you shine the light of reason directly in their eyes, and it doesn't help at all.
Right.
I mean, 65 is not as bad as 85, but it's still pretty darn bad.
Yep.
And it applies, not just in the case of Linda. There have been tons of studies of representativeness as a heuristic, and it seems quite robust. You can get the effect if you add sort of monetary stakes and say that, if you turn out to be right, we're going to pay you $20. You tend to get slightly less fallacy commitment in that kind of case, but still quite a bit, usually in the 50s. And you might think, well, okay, ordinary people aren't all that bright, especially when it comes to sort of probability judgments. So, let's go with someone who's really trained with this kind of thing, like a medical doctor. Well, Kahneman and Tversky ran a version of the study with doctors and asked them to rank things, not things about Linda, but about the probability that someone had various types of disorders. And even with doctors, they found that in about 75 to 85% of the cases, the doctors committed the fallacy. Now, doctors are a little bit more corrigible. So if you point out to the doctors, well, that doesn't work, then they'll mostly sort of go kind of sheepish and say, oh, yeah, sorry, I was just sort of making a quick decision.
Right.
So in some ways, their statistical training is sort of helping a bit, but they're still sort of very robustly using this kind of heuristic. And then the question becomes, well, can you have all 3 of these? Can you have the heuristics and biases, the reliabilist account of knowledge, and non-skepticism? And I think that there's quite some tension there, because these heuristics don't seem to be as reliable as you would need them to be for them to produce knowledge. So I'll see what April has to say about that.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you. That's a really nice presentation of the problem. And, it really seems like a real problem. And those are pretty worrisome results, and they seem to be pretty broad. And let me hear, I'll suggest a couple different kinds of responses. One of them will come from a different source of empirical work on bounded rationality. So I'll lead up to that with a couple points and see what you have to say about responding with some of the research on bounded rationality. A couple points before that, though. If this is a problem, it seems like it might be a problem for everyone. I'm not really sure that a virtue epistemologist would have more to worry about in this literature than other forms of epistemology. It seems like if we're really this unreliable in our ability to make inferences, that this would be a problem for foundationalists or coherentists or seemingly everybody. And if the skeptical problem here, if the skeptical challenge is too strong, it looks like really the situationist themselves is going to end up endorsing some form of skepticism. So that isn't necessarily a knockdown argument, but more that this may not be a problem specific to virtue epistemology. So there's that kind of response. One other quick point. We might appeal to some of these empirical results as virtue epistemologists and respond by saying that maybe we just need to lower our thresholds of how successful a successful cognitive agent needs to be in order to be counted amongst the virtuous or something like that. So those are a couple small points, but there seems to be some empirical research that at least might counter the argument that you've got from Kahneman and Tversky here. I'm thinking here in terms of the bounded rationality research. I think Gigerenzer and Herbert Simon and a number of other people have been developing this research program. So maybe I'll just briefly introduce what that is and suggest some ways in which that might be brought into the debate here. And we'll see what you have to say about that. So bounded rationality, and feel free when I wrap up here to add anything to the account of bounded rationality. So at least as I understand this, bounded rationality looks at how classical models of decision making in economics and the behavioral sciences assume that rational agents follow or conform to formal models of decision making, such as expected utility theory or Bayesian probability theorems. So we could call this the assumption of full rationality or unbounded rationality. These approaches assume that agents have enormous cognitive capacities. Utility maximization models require that agents know the prior and conditional probabilities of all relevant propositions, have preferences for all outcomes, and update probabilities with changes in their evidence. But real rational agents are limited in all sorts of ways, which makes optimizing rationality impossible because the optimizing strategy is computationally intractable or unknowable. So real human decisions exhibit bounded rationality, and classical models are thus non-explanatory and perhaps non-predictive. Bounded rational agents look for one good reason, they use shortcuts and heuristics rather than computational rules. Moreover, I think this is the pretty interesting part from Gigerenzer, we're more successful cognitive agents when we use these fast and frugal heuristics than when we use computational methods of reasoning. So bounded rationality can claim to be a superior descriptive and normative model of human rationality. Heuristics are less costly and more effective than Bayesian calculations. So that's a kind of general picture on bounded rationality, and Gigerenzer has a comment on the Linda case in particular. I thought that would be useful to look at. And then I'll just quickly suggest how virtue epistemologists might make use of this. So Gigerenzer's reading of the Linda the bank teller case, so infamously when asked whether it's more probable that given this character description of Linda, she's A, bank teller, or B, a bank teller and active in the feminist movement, we get these very disappointing results. 85% undergraduates, I think, said B. So clearly, committing the conjunction fallacy is violating some basic theorems of the probability calculus. But Gigerenzer notes that this task asks students to use syntactic, formal, content-blind rules of reasoning, where the values of the variables, the semantic content, isn't relevant to getting the right answer. And we typically do pretty poorly in content-blind reasoning. But I think this is the interesting part. When we reframe the question, we get very different results. If we ask instead, how many people out of 100 rather than how probable, we get better, more rational results. So if we asked, out of 100 people that satisfy Linda's description, how many would be bank tellers and how many would be bank tellers and active in the feminist movement, we get much better results. People will go with just the bank tellers. Um, so this seems to show that different framing of logically equivalent information will get very different results in the assessments of rationality. And the framing itself thus seems to be playing a big role here. So relative to certain frames, people can answer quite rationally. Um, so I've got a couple other points on this, but if there's anything you wanted to add to that before I do that,
Yeah,
you're
let's
welcome to.
since we got three things to deal with here, let me see if
Sure.
I can respond a bit. So the first thing you said was, well, why don't we just expand the problem and say, look, if people are really bad at inference, then it's a problem not just for virtue epistemology, especially reliabilism. It's a problem across the board, and to some extent, I think that that's right. But I think it's especially a problem for virtue epistemology, including reliabilism, because the reliabilist focuses so much on the dispositions that produce the beliefs in question. If you have a sort of very light touch and you go with a sort of, let's say, a modified version of the justified true belief um, account of knowledge, then when somebody uses a heuristic like this and gets it right, they end up with a true belief, you might be able to say that they have knowledge somehow. But if you're going with a reliabilist account and you know that this heuristic is not sufficiently reliable, then you're going to have to say that all of those cases where someone ends up with a true belief that's formed on the basis of this heuristic don't count as knowledge because they're not produced in accordance with or through intellectual virtue. So I think that on the one hand, yeah, it is a problem for everybody, but I think it's especially a problem for the reliabilist.
Uh-huh.
Um, the idea of maybe lowering the threshold of reliability is quite interesting, and you might want to go sort of contextualist and say either that the threshold becomes lower when the stakes are lower,
Right.
higher when the stakes are higher, or you might
Right.
say the threshold becomes lower based on sort of what we know about human nature, and if people are really bad at inference, then we just lower the threshold for inference because then just getting, let's say, 50% accuracy might represent sort of the best that people could hope for there. So it might
Mm-hmm.
be more like, a batting average than a free throw average.
Right.
I think that's interesting, and it's related to a suggestion that Alvin Goldman makes in Epistemology and Cognition. He actually discusses the Linda stuff a little bit there. And he basically says, well, you know what? Frankly, the fact that people have inconsistent beliefs in these cases or inconsistent estimates in these cases is just not that big a problem. Having inconsistency is just it's bad, but there are worse things.
Yeah.
And frankly, I find that kind of response kind of unsatisfying and maybe even a little lazy. It
Uh-huh.
seems to me that as philosophers, one of the things that we really ought to strive for is consistency. And one of the things that we really ought to expect of people is consistency. Because if you don't have consistency, then you're going to need some kind of paraconsistent reasoning, and that becomes really complicated. So if you think that, the kinds of reasoning that's expected of people by Bayesian epistemology is complicated and difficult. Well, if you started going paraconsistent, it becomes even harder. Um, so that's my response to the sort of
Okay.
lower threshold idea. Then with Giga Renzer, I think that that's exactly where we need to start looking. The sort of heuristics and biases 2.0 approach, as it were,
Mm-hmm.
showing what cases in which the heuristics that people use are actually pretty darn good.
Right.
And I think I might have mentioned as I was sort of describing the accessibility and the other heuristic, representativeness heuristic, that if you're going to use a heuristic, these ones are pretty good. It's certainly better
Right.
to use accessibility than anti-accessibility, or
Right.
representativeness than anti-representativeness.
Right.
So if you sort of want to tame heuristics and biases and say, well, let's just find the ones that are best for people like us in the circumstances that we're ordinarily in, then you might end up coming to some kind of conclusion that these things are, for people with our kinds of limitations, the best that can be hoped for. Whether
Right.
that they still get you to knowledge, though, I think is a different question.
Yeah, well, okay, that's interesting. So let me follow up on a couple of these points. It sounds like if the virtue epistemologist is especially susceptible to this kind of challenge because the heuristics that we're using don't seem to satisfy reliability requirements. I mean, it could be that this Gigerenzer research will direct us to ones that are. And as you, I think, were basically articulating here, there's at least that chance of developing a reliabilist virtue epistemology that makes use of heuristics as sources of reliable belief formation. So maybe that would be useful for if we can find these reliable heuristics. As you're
Yeah,
suggesting.
that seems right. And Gigerenzer is really into heuristics, and he says all kinds of wonderful things about them. He still, of course, doesn't think that they're always great.
Right.
He points out that sometimes heuristics go horribly astray,
Right.
and he, in his consulting practices, he actually helps people develop new heuristics. So he also
Hmm.
doesn't think that sort of the first one that comes to mind for the ordinary mature adult is going to be a good heuristic to use. He
Right.
thinks that we can sort of improve our use of heuristics through science. So
Right.
there's still a sort of ameliorative approach there. It's not a
Yeah.
sort of lazy approach that says, well, if that's
Right.
what we use, that's what we use, and they must be good enough.
Right, that sounds kind of slothful, just the opposite of kind of what intellectual virtue or something. So let me suggest one way that I might see, a virtue epistemologist might develop the kind of Gigerenzian account of virtues, at least kind of a general direction there, and say one other thing about dispositions before maybe we'll move on to the responsibilism. So I'll wrap up with a couple of these points. So de- developing this point about virtues and heuristics and the Gigerenzer research, um, I could see Gigerenzer's view suggesting something like this. Um, for every stable environment, maybe nature hath made it such that there will exist some reliable heuristic available to cognitive agents for achieving a range of cognitive tasks in that environment. Agents will then manifest intellectual virtues by identifying and employing the right heuristics in the right environments in the right ways. If they succeed in doing this regularly, they'll develop cognitive dispositions that are reliable in these environments. So I think we both were kind of seeing that that's at least a possible route for the virtue epistemologist. Admittedly, I think there would be some revision of virtue epistemology as it stands. At least most people aren't providing these kinds of requirements for knowledge in terms of heuristics and environments, but at least it seems like that would be a direction they could go. Um, so maybe
Yeah,
one,
that
maybe go
seems
ahead.
right. So the idea is, if you put an ordinary person on the moon, they would not be viable, and they wouldn't be able to run very well, even if you put them in a spacesuit, because they're not used to the gravity there.
Right,
So you wouldn't want to conclude from that that people can't run. You would just want to say that they can run on the Earth, but not on the moon. And in the same way, you might think that the kinds of heuristics that we use are pretty darn good in some circumstances, and much, much, much worse in certain other ones.
yeah, the
And part
virtue
of
will
the
be
goal of, yeah, part of the normative goal of cognitive science then would be to help us both identify and even construct circumstances in such a way that the heuristics that we're inclined to use will be reliable in them.
right. So let me mention a couple things here about dispositions that I think would just be a fruitful interface for situationism and virtue epistemology. I think there could be some fruitful exchanges here. Um, but it seems to me that the situationist literature brings to mind the phenomenon of masking, mimicking, and thinking from this flourishing literature on dispositions. And I think this is a promising direction to look to for understanding some of what's going on in these cases that the situationist literature describes. and also would illuminate some areas in virtue epistemology, in particular, what it is for a success to be sufficiently from virtue. Um, so a virtue or ability will only be reliable in a set of normal conditions, as you were just describing. This is a widely noted point. A skilled archer's ability to hit the mark can't be manifested in a tornado or if under the influence of heavy drugs, something like that. But these don't seem to count against attributing the ability to the archer because tornadoes and drugs are outside of the normal conditions for that ability. So this point's widely noted, but it hasn't been widely noted that in defining normal conditions for an ability, competence, or virtue, we appeal to the phenomenon of masking. Since it seems like the drug and the tornado mask the archer's ability, they also do so non-culpably, non-culpable masking, because they put the archer in non-normal conditions for that ability. So of course we could describe other cases of dispositional masking where the archer was culpable for his abilities being masked, and thus for his failures, if the masking condition seems irrelevant to one's being able to manifest a competence, that particular competence. So the situationist literature also seems to describe cases of masking, thinking, and mimicking, but especially in the case of masking, it needs to be shown that the kind of masking involved is of the culpable sort, and not the kind that takes the agent out of normal conditions. So I think we can see both kinds of masks. And I think exploring this intersection between virtue epistemology, situationism, and disposition theory, in particular the phenomenon of dispositional masking, thinking, and mimicking, is a really promising direction to look in for virtue epistemology and maybe for situationism as well. But I think virtue epistemology in particular could get a lot from looking at this burgeoning literature on dispositions. So,
Yeah, that sounds really quite helpful. So, for instance, if you're talking about a moral virtue, uh, if you say, well, I'm quite generous, but I don't give to charity when I'm asleep, that seems to be the sort of mask that is perfectly non-culpable. But if you say, I'm perfectly generous, but the thing is, I don't give to people when I don't feel like it.
mhm,
Well, that starts to sound a bit like you're getting into the culpable mask territory. And
right,
if you're dealing, say, with courage, and you say, I'm very courageous except when I'm afraid, that
right,
doesn't seem to be right the
right,
sort of mask that is allowable.
right,
So actually, this helps us, I think, transition really nicely into responsibilism,
yeah,
because responsibilism focuses on intellectual virtues that look a lot more like the classic ethical virtues. So things like conscientiousness, curiosity, creativity, flexibility, intellectual courage, various types of honesty, and so on.
yep,
So let me describe a kind of inconsistent triad for responsibilism as well.
okay,
You might recall that the inconsistent triad that I tried to articulate before had to do with non-skepticism about inference. This time I think it's not just about inference, but kind of across the board. The second proposition this time is not going to be reliabilism, but rather the responsibilist theory of knowledge, according to which someone knows that P just in case she acquired and retained the belief that P through the exercise of intellectual virtue, where here the intellectual virtues are understood to be the responsibilist ones like curiosity, creativity, intellectual courage, and conscientiousness. And then the third here would be a different kind of situationism that looks a lot more like ethical situationism, which says that the ways that people express or seem to have the traits that we would ordinarily identify as virtues are surprisingly susceptible to seemingly trivial and normatively or epistemically irrelevant situational influences. So let me give you a few examples of some of these. Um, so let's take, for instance, creativity. Um, Creativity is a sort of disposition to come up with novel solutions to problems, to come up with novel problems to old solutions, and so on. And intellectual flexibility is sort of the disposition to um, want to and be able to see things in new ways, let's say. Um, and here's one test of creativity and flexibility that's often used in psychology. It's called the Duncker Candle task, after Martha Duncker, who came up with it in the 50s, I believe. The basic idea here is that the psychologist comes to you in the lab and says, all right, I'm going to give you a few things. I'm going to give you a candle, some matches, and a box of tacks, right? Three things: candle, matches, and box of tacks. And your job in the next 10 minutes is somehow to affix that candle to this cork board here, this vertical cork board, in such a way that when you light the candle, no wax drips on the floor. Now, it's pretty
Mhm.
hard. In fact, typically only about 13% of people can solve this task. And they'll try various things. Sometimes people try tacking the candle directly to the cork board. It doesn't work. The candle sort of falls apart. Sometimes they try to melt some of the wax from the candle and use that as a kind of adhesive to stick it to the board. That also doesn't work. Basically, the only way to do this is to take the tacks out of the box, tack the box to the cork board as a kind of platform, and then
Mhm.
place the candle on that platform and light it that way. And the reason that people are pretty bad at solving the candle task is that when you present them with the box with the candles in it, they see it as sort of functionally related to the tacks. Um, they see it as a box of tacks as opposed to just a box or a thing with
Mhm.
this shape. And so, unless they have quite a bit of flexibility in how they see things, they're not going to realize that you could just empty the box out and tack it up that way as a platform.
Right.
Now, there are two ways to help people with the Duncker candle task. One is to present them the objects in a slightly different way. You present them as four things. Instead of a candle, a box of tacks, and some matches, it's a candle, a box, some tacks that are already outside the box, and the matches. If you do it that way, roughly 83% of people will solve the candle task. Right, so that's a jump from 13% to 83%. It's pretty good. And basically, it's because the creativity or flexibility required in this case is much lower. Somewhat surprisingly, another way that you can help people with the candle task is to give them the items in the same way as usual, but before you give the items, you let them have some candy, which usually
Mhm.
will sort of boost their mood. And
Right.
it turns out that if you give someone some candy, like some chocolate, just before the candle task, they'll solve it about 75% of the time. Now, that's not quite 83, so it doesn't take you all the way to what you would get if you sort of didn't require any flexibility at all. But it's a pretty big improvement from 13%.
Yeah.
And what this suggests, I think, is that a lot of people don't have sort of flexibility and creativity as such, but they have what you might call a sort of local virtue: creativity while in a good mood, or
Right.
flexibility while in a good mood.
Right.
And this sort of thing isn't just relevant to the candle task. So, another task of flexibility is the remote associates test.
Uh huh.
When you're doing a remote associates test, the psychologist will give you three words, like, say, sore, shoulder, and sweat, and ask you to come up with a fourth word that naturally conjoins with each of them. So the solution to that one is cold: cold sore, cold shoulder, cold sweat. Um, Another example is room, blood, and salts. So the
Mhm.
solution to that one is bath, right? Bathroom, blood bath, and bath salts. And people are not all that good at solving these things. But if you boost their mood in some way, either by giving them candy or letting them watch a comedy video, or giving them a small task and then telling them that they succeeded on it, their improvement on a remote associates test will improve usually by about 60 to 70%.
Yeah.
So again, this kind of suggests that people don't have the kind of creativity and flexibility across the board that you might have expected, but
Right.
that seemingly trivial and epistemically irrelevant situational influences can make them appear to have creativity and flexibility.
Right.
And if your account of knowledge is the responsibilist account, and you think that someone knows the answer to the remote associate's test only if he arrived at it through the exercise of creativity and flexibility, then the
Right.
people who get the right answer just because they're in a good mood or mostly because they're in a good mood don't actually know. And
Right.
that just seems crazy.
Yeah.
Same with the candle task. If you have the responsibilist account of knowledge and you look at the people who would not have gotten it right without the mood booster and do get it right when they have the mood booster, and you want to say, well, they don't know the solution to the candle task, that seems kind of mad. So this
Yeah.
suggests, I think, that you don't want to have a responsibilist account of knowledge.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. A couple points here. This connects to what I was just saying in with disposition theorem. I think we would see here that the candy or the good mood seems to be working as a dispositional mimic, where there's some feature of the environment that's actually causally responsible for your success. There's actually a lot of cases in epistemology, like the true temp case, if anybody's familiar with that, and other kinds of cases where we are supposed to deny knowledge because of the presence of these environmental mimics. And this seems to fit pretty nicely with that case, where the problem for the virtue epistemologist, probably more so than anybody, is that we really can't explain the character of the agent as the causally salient feature of their success. And that's really what I think the examples you're just pointing to really hit on, is that success from ability requirement seems to be failing here, even in cases where we get it right. I think that's an interesting
Right.
kind of challenge. So let me respond by looking at just briefly introducing a different research program from Walter Mischel, the cognitive affective processing systems research. And I'll say quickly what I think is interesting about that, and maybe we'll transition into looking forward. Um, so let me just briefly present Michelle and what I think is interesting there. Um, so Walter Michel's research has shown that the traditional assumption that people exhibit robust, cross-situationally stable personality traits is mistaken because of the influence of situational cues, or at least he was part of the early research showing some of the situationist results. But he then goes on to argue that psychologists have also been looking for consistency in the wrong places. Michel and his collaborator Yuichi Shoda, they argue that personality is a cognitive affective processing system that maintains stable personality traits as responses to internal stimuli, not external stimuli. So people interpret the situations they're in, and they argue that, Michel and Shoda, that we should look for consistent trait behavior in response to the subject's construal of the situation rather than its objective features. And indeed, they argue that empirical evidence shows that behavioral regularities across objectively different situation types, when situations have similar psychological meanings for subjects, is quite a bit higher. So they want to move to looking at how a virtuous agent responds to their subjective construals of a situation rather than the objective features of it. Where it looks like the situationist literature is tracking them according to the objective features of the situation rather than their subjective construal of it. So let me just note one point that I think is generally interesting here for virtue epistemology, and then I'll see what you want to say about that. So one interesting point about this CAPS approach to personality is that it connects to a point of Aristotle's that virtuous agents will differ from vicious agents not only in how they deliberate and respond to situations, but also in how they construe the situation to begin with. So virtuous agents discern the particular case under a different guise or mode of presentation than vicious agents, and this difference in their cognitive inputs, what they see it as, will trigger different deliberative responses and then different actions. So the literature on Aristotle refers to this difference as a difference in seeing as between the virtuous and the vicious agent. So I'll call this difference a difference in the salience content of their cognitive inputs. So two things are interesting here, I think. First, it looks like we can credit an agent for the salience content of their representations or cognitive inputs because it's a function of their virtuous character, hitherto. So the idea that knowledge is credit for true belief has been influential in work on the value problem, and it looks like we might have a novel form of epistemic credit in crediting an agent for the salience content of their cognitive inputs, which enables their virtuous responses. And this is a pretty different kind of credit than what we give for good transitions from cognitive inputs, which I think is the more typical kind. So this seems interesting. Also, it would just be interesting to see how a well-developed theory of salience content could show the epistemic significance of non-propositional contents. And finally, I'll just put out an interesting direction that virtue epistemology might take in response to this in maybe reframing the requirements for knowledge in terms of cultivating a virtue rather than manifesting a virtue. It looks like most of the failures that we're seeing here in the situationist literature is a failure to manifest a virtue, even in the cases where we're getting it right. But we could reframe our requirements for knowledge in terms of cultivation such that we'd get something like this, where cultivating a virtue doesn't require manifesting it because it doesn't require fully possessing it yet. So we could cultivate a virtue without manifesting one. So we might give the definition or requirements for knowledge in something like this. Knowledge would be something like a true belief acquired or sustained in the process of cultivating a virtue rather than manifesting one. So that might allow a virtue epistemologist to kind of sidestep these worries about manifesting virtues that are raised by the situationist literature. So I'll leave it there. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. So yeah, I think this stuff on construal is very interesting and very important. It's come up a lot in the discussion of virtue ethics as well. I'm afraid that my own take on the importance of construal is actually that it makes having a virtue much harder than rather than making it easier. So people who've argued in respect to virtue ethics that construal somehow will save virtue ethics from the situationist critique include Gopal Srinivasan and Dan Russell and Nancy Snow, and they all say, well, look, if you just sort of go inside and see whether you've got consistency from the point of view of the agent and how he or she sees the world, you'll find higher consistency across situations, which in turn will mean that people do have some kinds of character traits or virtues. But this, to me, seems mistaken in a couple of ways. First of all, as you said, Aristotle and Aristotelians up until the situationist critique sort of came around said that having a virtue involves actually construing in the right way. And so if someone fails to construe in the right way and then sort of acts as the virtuous person would act on the basis of that mistaken construal, well, they're already failing to exhibit virtue. And so you can't say that, well, the fact that they misconstrued and then did everything else right means that they do have the trait. It means, in fact,
Well,
that they've already failed to have the trait.
but I mean,
Um,
well, just quickly, I wonder if that might just be a reliabilist failure rather than a responsibilist failure. If
so can you say
they're
what you mean by that?
So if they're misconstruing the situation to begin with, that seems like that might be a failure in their perceptual capacities or something like that. Um, but if they're proceeding virtuously from that point on, it looks like kind of cases like the BIV, brain in your back case, or demon cases, we typically would credit an agent with justification if they're reasoning responsibly or reasoning well from let's say, false inputs that are given to them from a demon or something like that. So maybe that would be consistent with still seeing them as exhibiting responsibilist virtues, even if that's reasoning from a false input.
That's fair enough. I think that the kinds of misconstruals that you get in the psychological literature are not quite as uh, extreme as, say, demons or brain in the vat type situations. This is
Yeah,
stuff like mood
right,
elevators and mood depressors.
right.
And so
Yeah,
whether someone is inclined to misconstrue whenever she's in a good mood or whenever she's in a bad mood seems to me to be sort of a culpable sort of failure. But
yeah,
that said,
that sounds reasonable.
the idea that instead of defining knowledge in terms of manifesting intellectual virtue, rather in terms of cultivating intellectual
Hmm.
virtue, is really interesting. Um, I wonder to what extent you think that cultivating a virtue has to be an intentional activity. So, right, take for instance a skill like playing the
Hmm.
piano. You're not cultivating the ability to play the piano unless you're sort of going about practicing, reading about it, uh, getting
Right,
lessons, and so
right.
on.
Yeah,
Right, so it's a sort of very intentional project. And
yeah.
I wonder to what extent, especially once people achieve adulthood, they actually go about cultivating intellectual virtues. I think
Right,
some do.
right.
And you,
Apparently
you
not
see
that
that
many.
when people take up hobbies and stuff, but it's not clear to me that that's going to help all that much,
Yeah.
except for the people who are sort of into self improvement and therefore are actively trying to cultivate.
Right. Yeah, actually, I think that's a really nice response. I mean, I think this might suffer from maybe a psychological implausibility problem, and that we're going to just be requiring too much complex psychological machinery for people to acquire knowledge, which happens pretty easily and pretty often. So, yeah, that's actually a really nice point. So I think we'd at least have to look at that pretty closely if that were a direction to turn in. Um, yeah. Well, do you want to suggest some directions forward? I could start by, unless there's anything you wanted to add to the dialectic there, we might.
Yeah, well, I guess it's a pity we've run out of time already, and so we're not
I
going to
know,
get to
yeah,
talk about inquiry responsibilism. I'll
yeah.
just say that this is something I talk about a little bit in a paper that's just come out with Phil Quarterly.
Hmm.
And there's some pretty fun examples in there about the Ash paradigm and people doing what everyone else is doing, not because they want to, but because everyone else is doing it. So
Right,
if
yeah,
you want to take a look at that.
yeah.
But
I would, and
yeah, go ahead
also
and
there's.
tell me what you think is the upshot of this, or where should we go from here?
Yeah, well, there's also interesting stuff on metacognition. I think that would be interesting to look at. There's the five-factor personality traits, and really just so much interesting stuff here that it's kind of fitting that we've run out of time to talk about it all. And in part, that's kind of my look forward is that while this is presented and probably is a significant challenge to virtue epistemology, I think it really opens up so many interesting questions. And it's just a really fertile place to look for further research and further work at this intersection of moral psychology, social psychology, and virtue epistemology. It's really pretty uncharted territory. So I think it really opens up just a wealth of opportunities in virtue epistemology, and hopefully I think it won't be brought down in the process. But there should be one thing in particular that seems interesting to me. Um, I'm interested in looking at what a naturalized virtue epistemology would look like. I mean, virtue ethics is often seen as broadly naturalistic, and I think we could say the same thing, at least for some forms of virtue epistemology, but it hasn't really been explicitly brought into work on virtue epistemology, what it would be to do this in a naturalistic way. Um, One area of research that would, I think, become prominent in a naturalized virtue epistemology seems to be precisely this: the situationist literature, cognitive psychology, social psychology. This is all going to have to be looked at and determined how we can incorporate this empirical work into our work on virtue epistemology. up until now, virtue epistemology has really expanded the normative aspect of knowledge, and I think it's had a helpful and beneficial effect on epistemology in that respect. But I think it's time now also to look at the empirical commitments of this normative framework, and I think that's really lots of interesting opportunities to do that by engaging with the situationist literature. So that seems like an interesting, very interesting direction going forward.
Yeah,
That'll
that's
be it for
great.
me.
So metacognition, I think, is going to turn out to be pretty interesting. So, right, on the one hand, it would help you to get an account of higher order knowledge, knowledge that you know something, because presumably that's going to involve quite a lot of metacognition. It seems to me that it might also help with lower order, first order knowledge. In fact, I'm working on a paper right now on stereotype threat, which is what happens when someone knows that they belong to a group that is expected to perform poorly on a certain task, and they sort of live up to or down to, as it might be, expectations. This has affected black students who take the SAT, women who take tests in mathematics, and it's been documented by psychologists for the last 15 or 18 years or so. It seems that metacognitive strategies actually help quite a bit in eliminating or at least blunting the force of stereotype threat. If you know that this might happen and you understand the mechanism, the effect mostly goes away. So it seems like the metacognition
Interesting.
could actually help in some interesting ways.
Interesting.
I'm more skeptical of the five-factor theory, mostly because I think the traits that it makes reference to are just way too broad to be normatively good or bad. So
Mm-hmm.
the five-factor
Right.
theory is sometimes the people use a mnemonic ocean to remember
Right.
it. So the O is openness, the C is conscientiousness, the E is extroversion, the A is agreeableness, and the N is neuroticism. And you might think, well, openness, that's surely going to be a virtue. But if you look at the sorts of things that count as openness according to psychologists, it sort of bleeds over into suggestibility. And
Right.
then you say, like, well, some aspects of openness are good, some are bad. I don't know what to make of this from a normative point of view.
Right.
Conscientiousness also seems like it might be really helpful because, after all, at least according to some virtue epistemologists like James Montmarquet,
Right.
um, conscientiousness is the cardinal intellectual virtue. And you might
Right.
think, well, if its intellectual
Uh,
credentials are so good, sorry, if its empirical credentials are so good that it's one of the five things in the five factor theory, that would be great.
yeah.
But if you look at the conscientiousness that psychologists are studying, it doesn't resemble in any way what Montmarquet means by conscientiousness. So he
Interesting.
means the trait of wanting to believe the truth and to avoid error. And
Mm-hmm.
conscientiousness, as psychologists study it, is much broader than that. It involves aspects of obsessiveness and compulsiveness, and it's much more social, and it just doesn't look like an intellectual kind of trait.
Yeah.
Something that seems
Interesting.
a bit more promising is need for cognition. I'm not going to go into it now, but there's one very interesting article in Phil Psych, Philosophical Psychology by Reza Larudi, on need for cognition as an intellectual virtue, which I
Right.
recommend to everyone. And then my own stuff works on what I call factitious or artificial virtue, where telling someone that they have a trait gets them to act as if they do, even if they don't really. And it
Right.
seems to me that we have some evidence from social psychology that this works not for the sort of purely cognitive traits that reliabilists focus on, but for the more motivational intellectual virtues that responsibilists talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So even if people don't have, let's say, curiosity and creativity, I'm going to suggest that we should tell them that they do, because that's going to get them to act as if they do, which is certainly a lot better than not acting as if they do.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. Well, that's great. I think this has been really interesting. Thanks for the conversation.
Great. Nice to talk with you, April, and I'll hope
All
to
right.
see you again soon.
Great. And I look forward to seeing your book.
Bye bye.